The assembly hall of the Galactic Coalition stretched for miles in every direction, its crystalline walls refracting the light of a dozen different suns through massive viewing ports. Representatives from 300 species sat in their designated sections, their various forms creating a tapestry of evolution that had taken the galaxy millions of years to weave. The Zephyrians floated in their gaseous chambers, the Thrakari stood tall on their 6 legs, and the diminutive Kree huddled together in their heated pods. At the center of it all, a single human sat alone at a simple metal table. Colonel Sarah Chen had seen many rooms in her 47 years of life, but none quite like this. The weight of 300 civilizations' attention pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. She had been a soldier for most of her adult life, had commanded fleets that turned the tide of the Coalition War, and had earned medals from species whose names she still couldn't pronounce properly. Today, she wore none of those decorations. Today, she wore only the simple gray uniform of a war criminal awaiting judgment. Ambassador Vex High of the Altarian hegemony rose from the central dais, his 4 arms spreading wide in a gesture of authority that translated across species barriers. The Altarians had been the first to achieve faster-than-light travel, the first to establish interstellar trade routes, and for 3,000 years they had been the unofficial peacekeepers of the galaxy. Their blue-scaled faces showed no emotion, as Vex High's mental voice echoed through the neural translators every delegate wore. Colonel Chen, the voice resonated in her mind with the weight of ancient authority, you stand before this assembly accused of war crimes of unprecedented magnitude, the destruction of the hegemony's 7th fleet, the orbital bombardment of 3 inhabited worlds, and the deployment of weapons banned by 17 different interstellar treaties. How do you answer these charges? Sarah looked up from her clasped hands, her brown eyes meeting the golden orbs of the Altarian ambassador. Around the hall, she could see the various species watching her, with mixtures of curiosity, disgust, and fear. The humans had been the newest members of the Galactic Coalition, admitted only 50 years ago after finally developing reliable FTL technology. They were still considered primitive by most species, barely evolved from their homeworld's violent past. Guilty, she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. A wave of shocked, chittering, humming, and mental static rippled through the assembled delegates. Many had expected denials, justifications, or at least an attempt at explaining the circumstances. Her simple admission sent translators scrambling to confirm they had heard correctly. Vexai's head tilted in what might have been confusion. You admit to these crimes without reservation? Without attempting to justify your actions during the war? I admit to every action I took during the war, Sarah replied, standing slowly from her chair. But I think you misunderstand what those actions really were, and why they were necessary. The Kree delegate, a creature no larger than a human child but with the wisdom of centuries, spoke in their high whistling language. Their words came through the translator as, necessary? You speak of necessity when you burned 3 worlds? Sarah turned to face the small being, her expression softening slightly. I speak of necessity because those 3 worlds were already dead, honored Kree, and every being in this room would have joined them if I hadn't acted. A new voice cut through the murmurs, deep and resonant. It belonged to General Takmor of the Rhodian Empire, a species known throughout the galaxy for their military prowess and strategic thinking. The Rhodians resembled massive insects, with chitinous armor that had evolved on a world where everything was predator or prey. Explain yourself, human. We have reviewed the tactical data from your final engagement. Your actions were those of a being driven to madness by war. Sarah looked at the towering Rhodian general, remembering the first time she had met his kind. It had been during the early days of the war, when the coalition forces were still trying to understand what they were truly fighting against. The Rhodians had impressed her with their discipline and their honor, qualities that had made the final days of the war even more difficult.
General Takmor,
she said, inclining her head respectfully.
Your people have a saying, don't you?
Know your enemy as you know yourself. I learned that phrase from one of your officers, Major Clicktar, before he died saving my ship during the Battle of Kepler, Texas. 442. The Rhodian's antenna twitched, a sign of surprise in his species. You knew Clicktar? He was a good soldier and a better friend, Sarah replied. "He taught me many things about strategy, about honor, and about the price of making difficult choices. It was his wisdom that helped me understand what we were really fighting in the final days of the war." The mention of the war's final days sent another wave of unrest through the assembly. The last 6 months of the Coalition War remained classified at the highest levels, known only to the senior command staff of each species. Officially, the war had ended when the enemy forces had suddenly withdrawn from all contested systems, their massive fleets disappearing into the dark spaces between stars. The Coalition had declared victory, celebrated their survival, and begun the long process of rebuilding their shattered worlds. Only a select few knew the truth about those final months, and fewer still knew the role that Colonel Sarah Chen had played in ending a war that had nearly consumed every living thing in the galaxy. Dr. Yith Aurora of the Cerebral Collective floated in her nutrient tank, her vast brain pulsing with bioluminescent thoughts. The Cerebrals were the galaxy's foremost experts in warfare and strategy, their enhanced minds capable of processing millions of variables simultaneously. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of pure logic. Colonel Chen, the translated voice was clinically precise. "Our analysis of your final actions shows tactical decisions that defied all military doctrine. You divided your forces when outnumbered, attacked fortified positions with inferior firepower, and used weapons that violated your own species' rules of engagement. These are not the actions of a rational military mind." Sarah smiled grimly at the Cerebral's assessment. "You're absolutely right, Dr. Yithara. By any rational military doctrine, what I did was suicide. My own command staff tried to stop me. Admiral Torres threatened to have me court-martialed. Captain Morrison locked himself in his quarters rather than carry out my orders. But they didn't understand what I had learned about our enemy, and more importantly, what I had learned about my own species." "And what had you learned?" asked Ambassador Zarathul of the Empathic Union, her voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that allowed her people to feel the emotions of others across vast distances. The empaths had been the first to detect the psychic emanations of the enemy fleets, had been the first to realize that what they faced was unlike anything in the galaxy's recorded history. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either damn her forever or begin to explain the impossible choice she had been forced to make. "I learned that humanity's greatest weakness, the thing that every species in this room has noted about us, criticized us for, and tried to help us overcome, was actually our greatest strength." The silence that followed was complete. Even the ambient hums of life support systems seemed to fade as every consciousness in the assembly focused on the human woman standing alone at the center of their judgment. "You see," Sarah continued, "when you're fighting an enemy that can predict every logical move, anticipate every rational strategy, and counter every reasonable tactic, logic becomes your enemy. When you face something that has studied every military doctrine in the galaxy, learned from every great strategic mind across 300 species, and can simulate the outcome of any conventional battle before it begins, conventional thinking will get you killed." She began to pace slowly around her table, her hands clasped behind her back in a military stance that was unmistakably human. "The entity we were fighting, and yes, I say entity because it wasn't really an invasion in any sense that your species would understand, had been watching us for centuries. It had learned our patterns, studied our behaviors, and absorbed the knowledge of every civilization it had encountered before us." Ambassador Vexhai's mental voice carried a note of skepticism. "You speak of this enemy as if it were a single consciousness. Our intelligence indicated a conventional fleet structure with clear command hierarchies, because that's what it wanted you to see," Sarah replied. "The ships, the apparent commanders, the tactical formations, all of it was theater designed to make us respond in predictable ways. The real enemy was something far more dangerous, a collective intelligence that had been growing stronger with each civilization it absorbed." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. The official record spoke of the Devourers as an aggressive species with advanced technology, not as some kind of hive mind or collective entity. The truth had been suppressed to prevent panic, but now Sarah was laying it bare before the representatives of every major civilization in the galaxy. General Tackmore's mandibles clicked in agitation. If this is true, then why were we not informed? Why was this intelligence kept from the senior command? Because, Sarah said, meeting the Rhodians' compound eyes, every single strategic simulation we ran ended the same way. Total defeat. Complete absorption of all coalition forces, and the eventual consumption of every inhabited world in the galaxy. The thing we were fighting didn't just want to conquer us, it wanted to become us, to add our knowledge and capabilities to its own collective consciousness. Dr. Yathara's brain patterns shifted to a deep purple, indicating profound calculation. Such an entity would indeed be beyond conventional military response. The absorption of 300 species worth of knowledge and capability would make it essentially undefeatable through normal means. Exactly, Sarah nodded. And that's when I realized what I had to do. The one thing that no rational military mind would ever consider. The one strategy that would be so insane, so illogical, so fundamentally wrong by every standard of civilized warfare that even our enemy wouldn't see it coming. The assembly waited in breathless silence as Sarah prepared to reveal the truth that had been hidden for 5 years. Her next words would explain not just her actions during the war's final days, but the real reason why humanity had been able to accomplish what 300 more advanced civilizations could not. I had to stop thinking like a soldier, she said quietly, and start thinking like a human. The weight of those words settled over the assembly like a physical presence. Every delegate understood that they were about to hear something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about warfare, about strategy, and about the species that had somehow managed to save them all. In the viewing galleries above the main floor, human observers watched their representative prepare to reveal secrets that their own government had classified beyond top secret. They knew that Sarah Chen was about to explain actions that had branded her a war criminal in the eyes of most of the galaxy. But they also knew that those same actions had prevented the extinction of every living thing in known space. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibilities and heavy with the weight of revelation. 300 species waited to learn what it really meant to think like a human, and why that difference had made all the difference in a war that should have been unwinnable. Sarah looked up at the vast dome of the assembly hall, where the light of distant stars painted patterns on the crystalline ceiling. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the collective intelligence they had fought still drifted in the dark spaces between galaxies, no longer a threat but not entirely destroyed. The victory had come at a price that she would carry for the rest of her life, but it had been necessary. The first thing you have to understand about humans, she began, is that we're the only species in this galaxy that evolved from persistence hunters. The concept of persistence hunting was unfamiliar to most of the assembly. The Altarians had evolved as ambush predators, using their mental abilities to trap prey in psychic mazes. The Rhodians had developed as hive defenders, their entire species organized around protecting their colonies from external threats. Even the aggressive Thrakari had evolved as pack hunters, using overwhelming numbers and coordinated attacks to bring down their prey. Persistence hunting, Sarah continued, means chasing something until it collapses from exhaustion. Not outsmarting it, not overpowering it, not setting traps or using superior weapons, just following it, step by step, kilometer by kilometer, day after day, until it simply can't run anymore. She gestured to the viewing screens around the assembly, which displayed star charts showing the final movements of the war. Look at the tactical data from the last 6 months. Every military analyst in the galaxy has studied these patterns, trying to understand what happened. What do you see? Yatara's brain pulsed with rapid calculations. Erratic movement patterns, inefficient resource allocation, tactical decisions that violated basic strategic principles. Exactly, Sarah nodded. Because I wasn't trying to win battles. I was trying to make the enemy run. Ambassador Zarathal's empathic abilities allowed her to sense the emotional undertones of Sarah's words. But running implies fear. Our psychological profiles of you indicated that fear was your primary emotional state during that period. I was terrified, Sarah admitted without hesitation. Every day, every hour, every decision I made filled me with more fear than I had ever experienced in my life. But that's the thing about humans that you need to understand. We don't run from fear. We run toward it. The admission sent another wave of confusion through the assembly. Most species had evolved to avoid unnecessary risks, to preserve their populations through careful planning and strategic thinking. The idea of deliberately moving toward danger was antithetical to millions of years of evolutionary programming. General Tackmore's antennae twitched with agitation. "You speak in contradictions, human. How does one run toward fear while simultaneously making an enemy run from you?" Sarah's expression grew distant as she remembered those final months of the war. "Let me tell you about the Battle of Proxima Taurus, General. You were there, commanding the Rhodian 4th Division. Do you remember my orders that day?" The massive Rhodian's chitinous armor clicked as he shifted uncomfortably. "Your orders were to abandon our defensive positions and attack the enemy's strongest fortification with our weakest ships. I refused to carry them out." "And yet you followed me when I went anyway," Sarah pointed out, "along with every other commander in the fleet. Why?" "'Cause." General Tackmore's voice carried a note of grudging respect. Watching a single human destroyer charge a battle station that outmassed it by a factor of 50 was either the act of a madwoman or someone who understood something the rest of us didn't. "Both," Sarah said with a bitter smile. "I was absolutely insane by any rational standard, and I did understand something that the rest of you couldn't. I understood that the collective intelligence we were fighting had absorbed the tactical knowledge of hundreds of species, but it had never encountered a species that made strategy decisions based on pure stubbornness." The viewing screens shifted to display the battle recordings from Proxima Taurus. The assembly watched as a single human destroyer, the UES Indomitable, accelerated directly toward a massive enemy construct that bristled with weapons designed to eliminate entire fleets. The ship's shields collapsed within seconds, its armor began to ablate under the concentrated fire, and any rational commander would have ordered an immediate retreat. Instead, the Indomitable kept coming. The enemy had calculated every possible response to their fortification. Sarah explained as the battle played out. They knew exactly how much firepower it would take to stop any conventional attack, how many ships they could destroy before retreat became inevitable, and how to position their forces for maximum psychological impact. What they hadn't calculated was what would happen if someone simply refused to stop. The recording showed the moment when the enemy's firing patterns began to shift. The massive construct that had been methodically picking apart the coalition fleet suddenly began to move, its weapons tracking frantically as the burning human destroyer continued its impossible charge. "It wasn't fear," Dr. Frass, Yathara observed, her analytical mind processing the tactical data. "The enemy construct was confused." "Exactly." Sarah nodded. For the first time in the war, the collective intelligence encountered something it couldn't predict or understand, a response that violated every principle of self-preservation, every rule of tactical engagement, and every pattern of behavior it had observed in 300 species. The recording continued as other coalition ships, inspired by the Indomitable's charge, began their own impossible attacks. Rhodian heavy cruisers abandoned their defensive formations to follow the burning human ship. Altairian mine ships dropped their psychic shields to focus all their energy on offensive strikes. Even the cautious Kree emerged from their protective formations to add their firepower to the assault. "That was the moment," Sarah said quietly, "when I realized we had found our enemy's weakness. Not a technological vulnerability or a strategic blind spot, but a conceptual one. The collective intelligence had absorbed the knowledge and capabilities of hundreds of species, but they had all been rational species, logical species, species that made decisions based on calculated outcomes and reasonable expectations of success." Ambassador Vex Hai's mental voice carried a note of understanding. "Species that would retreat when faced with impossible odds. But humans don't retreat when the stakes are high enough," Sarah continued. "We double down. We dig in. We decide that if we're going to lose, we're going to make it so expensive for the enemy that they'll regret starting the fight in the first place." The battle recording reached its climax as the Indomitable, now more wreckage than ship, finally reached the enemy construct. Its ramming attack shouldn't have done more than cosmetic damage to something so massive, but the psychological impact was devastating. The collective intelligence, faced with an opponent that simply refused to behave rationally, began to make its own irrational decisions. The construct could have easily avoided the collision, General Tackmore observed. Its tactical systems were fully functional. "But it didn't," Sarah replied. Because for the first time in its existence, the collective intelligence was experiencing something it had never felt before: doubt. Not about the outcome of the battle, it still had overwhelming superiority, but about its understanding of its opponents. The assembly watched in silence as the recording showed the aftermath of the collision. The enemy construct, damaged but still functional, suddenly began to withdraw from the battle. Its escort fleets, which had been systematically destroying coalition forces, broke off their attacks and formed protective formations around their flagship. "That was the beginning of the end," Sarah said. "From that moment on, the collective intelligence wasn't fighting to win. It was fighting to understand. And the more it tried to understand human behavior, the more confused and erratic its own responses became." Dr. Yathara's brain patterns shifted to deep blue, indicating profound realization. "You weaponized your own irrationality." "I weaponized humanity's greatest flaw," Sarah corrected. "Our complete inability to know when we're beaten." Every other species in the galaxy has evolved some mechanism for recognizing hopeless situations and withdrawing to preserve themselves. It's rational, it's logical, and it's how intelligent beings survive in a hostile universe. She paused, looking around at the representatives of those rational, logical species. But humans evolved differently. We developed on a world where retreat often meant death anyway, where the only chance of survival was to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. We became a species that would rather die trying than live with surrender. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Every species in the assembly had studied human behavior during their integration into the coalition, and most had concluded that this particular trait was evidence of primitive thinking that would fade as humanity matured. Now they were learning that this primitive stubbornness had been the key to their collective survival. Ambassador Zara Thule spoke for many when she said, "But surely this trait would only work against an enemy that was susceptible to psychological warfare. A purely mechanical intelligence would be immune to such tactics." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "Against machines, human stubbornness is just another form of suicide." But we weren't fighting machines. We were fighting a collective consciousness made up of billions of absorbed minds, all of which had once belonged to rational, intelligent species. The collective had all their knowledge, all their capabilities, and all their psychological patterns. The implications hit the assembly like a physical blow. If the enemy had absorbed the minds of other species, then it carried within itself all the psychological vulnerabilities of those species, including the rational fear of pursuing a losing battle. "The more we refused to behave rationally," Sarah continued, "the more the collective began to doubt its own calculations. It started second-guessing strategies that should have been certain victories. It began to withdraw from battles it was winning. And most importantly, it started to fragment. The viewing screen shifted again, showing sensor readings from the war's final phase. The enemy fleets, which had moved with perfect coordination for years, began to show signs of internal conflict. Ships broke formation without orders, attacked targets that served no strategic purpose, and in some cases, the collective intelligence was experiencing something it had never encountered in millions of years of existence. Sarah explained.
Internal disagreement.
Some parts of its consciousness wanted to continue the fight, confident in their superiority. Other parts, influenced by the absorbed minds of species that had faced humanity before, began to advocate for withdrawal. MSP! General Tackmore's compound eyes focused intently on the human kernel. "You drove it to civil war. I drove it to experience what every organic species deals with every day," Sarah replied. The conflict between logical thinking and emotional response. The collective had absorbed billions of minds, but it had never had to deal with the internal chaos that comes from being truly alive. The revelation was staggering. The enemy that had threatened to consume every living thing in the galaxy had been defeated not by superior firepower or brilliant strategy, but by being forced to confront its own internal contradictions. Dr. Ithara's analytical mind was working furiously to process the implications, but this would require a level of psychological sophistication that our intelligence services never detected in human strategic thinking. Sarah laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "That's because there was no strategic thinking involved. That's the point you're all missing." I didn't sit down and plan to use psychological warfare against a collective consciousness. I didn't develop some brilliant scheme to exploit the enemy's psychological vulnerabilities. She looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes and optical sensors of delegates from across the galaxy. I just did what humans do when we're cornered and scared and facing something we can't defeat. I got angry and decided that if we were going down, we were taking as many of them with us as possible. The simplicity of it was almost incomprehensible to the assembled representatives. They had spent years analyzing the final phase of the war, looking for evidence of some grand strategy or hidden plan that had turned the tide of battle. The idea that humanity had won through pure emotional response rather than calculated tactics was alien to everything they understood about warfare. The orbital bombardment of the three worlds, Ambassador Vexai said slowly. You said they were already dead. What did you mean? Sarah's expression grew grim as she prepared to reveal the most classified secret of the entire war.
Those weren't enemy strongholds, she said quietly.
They were processing centers. The collective intelligence had been using them to convert captured populations into new components of its consciousness. The horror of the revelation sent waves of shock through the assembly. The three worlds that Sarah had bombarded from orbit hadn't been military targets. They had been prison camps on a scale beyond imagination. By the time we discovered what those facilities really were, Sarah continued, there were over 2 billion beings from 40 different species being held there. The collective was systematically extracting their memories, their knowledge, their very consciousness, and adding it to its own. The math was staggering. 2 billion minds would have more than doubled the collective's processing power and strategic capabilities. The absorption of so many diverse consciousness patterns would have made it even more adaptable and unpredictable. The rescue mission would have taken weeks to organize, General Tackmore said, understanding beginning to dawn in his compound eyes. By then, the process would have been complete, and the collective would have become unstoppable. Sarah nodded. So I made the choice that no rational commander would ever make. I sacrificed 2 billion people to save everyone else in the galaxy. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Every delegate in the assembly understood the mathematics of the situation. But understanding and accepting were two different things. The idea of deliberately targeting civilian populations violated every rule of civilized warfare. The weapons you used, Dr. Yathara said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were designed to ensure complete sterilization of all biological matter. Because I couldn't risk leaving any trace of the collective's processing centers intact, Sarah replied. If even one facility had survived, if even a single component of those absorption chambers had remained functional, the collective could have rebuilt everything we had destroyed. She had condemned 2 billion beings to death to prevent their absorption into something even worse than death. It was a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life, but it had been the only choice that offered any hope of victory. The assembly sat in stunned silence as the full scope of Sarah's decision became clear. She had not just committed war crimes, she had committed them knowingly, deliberately, and with full understanding of their necessity. She had chosen to become a monster to prevent something far worse from consuming the galaxy. That's when the collective intelligence finally understood what it was really fighting, Sarah said, breaking the silence. Not just another species to be absorbed, but something fundamentally different. Something that would choose extinction over assimilation, that would sacrifice everything rather than submit. The psychological impact of that realization had been the final blow to the collective's cohesion. Faced with an enemy that preferred mutual destruction to defeat, the ancient intelligence had finally encountered a concept it couldn't process: the willing embrace of absolute loss. The viewing screens around the assembly hall now displayed the final battle of the war, though few in attendance had ever seen the complete, unedited recordings. The Coalition had officially classified these files beyond top secret, and for good reason. What they showed challenged every assumption about warfare, victory, and the price of survival. The Battle of the Nexus Point, Sarah said, her voice barely carrying across the vast chamber. The collective intelligence's final stronghold, protected by the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. 12,000 ships, each one more advanced than anything in our own arsenals. Weapons that could crack planets, shields that could withstand supernovas, and tactical systems that had absorbed the military knowledge of 300 civilizations. The display showed the approaching human fleet, a ragged collection of damaged ships that had been fighting non-stop for 6 months. By any rational assessment, they were facing impossible odds. The human force numbered less than 300 vessels, most of them showing severe battle damage. Their ammunition reserves were nearly exhausted, their crews were operating on pure adrenaline and caffeine, and their tactical situation was hopeless. "My staff tried to talk me out of the attack," Sarah continued. "Admiral Torres actually relieved me of command and ordered the fleet to withdraw. Captain Morrison locked himself in his quarters and refused to acknowledge any further orders. Commander Williams, my own tactical officer, submitted a formal request for psychological evaluation, claiming I had suffered a complete mental breakdown." General Thacmore's antennae twitched with what might have been amusement. "Your own officers mutinied?" "They tried to," Sarah replied with a bitter smile. "But here's another thing about humans that your species might not understand, General. When we see someone doing something impossibly stupid and dangerous, our first instinct isn't to stop them, it's to help them do it better." The recording showed what happened next. Despite their official protests and formal objections, the human fleet maintained formation behind Sarah's flagship. When she ordered the attack, they followed. When she led the charge into impossible odds, they charged with her. Commander Williams unlocked his tactical station and began feeding me targeting data, Sarah said. Admiral Torres took personal command of the point defense grid. Captain Morrison emerged from his quarters in full battle dress and reported to his bridge. They thought I was insane, they knew the mission was suicide, and they followed me anyway. Dr. 3. Yathara's brain patterns shifted to deep orange, indicating confusion bordering on distress. Such behavior is completely irrational. If they believed your mission would fail, why didn't they simply refuse to participate? "Because," Sarah said, looking directly at the Cerebral's tank, "that's not how humans work. When one of us decides to do something spectacularly stupid, the rest of us don't abandon them to face the consequences alone. We join them, add our own stupidity to theirs, and see if we can make the whole thing even more impossible." The concept was so alien to most of the assembled species that their translators struggled to find equivalent terms. The idea of deliberately participating in a doomed venture out of loyalty rather than logic violated every principle of rational behavior. "The collective intelligence was monitoring our communications," Sarah continued. "It heard every argument between my officers, every protest, every formal objection to the mission. It calculated the probability of mutiny at 97%. It expected my own fleet to turn on me before we reached the battle zone." The recording showed the moment when the human fleet entered weapons range of the massive enemy formation. Instead of the coordinated tactical maneuvers that had characterized previous battles, the human ships began to spread out in seemingly random directions. Some accelerated directly toward the largest enemy vessels. Others began complicated, evasive patterns that served no apparent strategic purpose, and a few simply stopped moving altogether and began broadcasting surrender signals. "What were you doing?" Ambassador Vexay asked, his mental voice carrying genuine bewilderment. "Exactly what we always do when faced with impossible odds," Sarah replied. "We stopped trying to win and started trying to cause as much chaos as possible before we died." The tactical display showed the enemy fleet's response to this unprecedented behavior. Ships that had been maintaining perfect formation began to break ranks as they tried to track targets that were behaving in completely unpredictable ways. Weapon systems that had been calibrated for maximum efficiency began to waste fire on decoy signals and empty space. The collective intelligence, for all its absorbed knowledge and tactical sophistication, had never encountered an enemy that treated warfare as an exercise in creative suicide. The U.S. Defiance began ramming smaller enemy ships, not to destroy them, but to knock them into the paths of larger vessels, Sarah narrated as the battle unfolded. The U.S. Vendetta started broadcasting false surrender signals while simultaneously launching every torpedo in its arsenal. The U.S. Stubborn deliberately flew into a black hole rather than allow itself to be captured. Each act of tactical insanity was small in isolation, but their cumulative effect was devastating to an enemy that relied on predictable behavior patterns. The collective intelligence found itself trying to counter strategies that had no logical basis, to predict the actions of opponents who were actively trying to confuse themselves. That's when it happened. Sarah said, pointing to a moment in the recording where the enemy formation suddenly began to collapse inward. The collective intelligence experienced its first panic attack. The statement was so absurd that several delegates actually laughed, their various species' expressions of amusement creating a cacophony of sounds through the chamber. The idea of a cosmic intelligence suffering from anxiety was beyond comprehension. "I'm serious," Sarah continued, ignoring the laughter. "Think about what the collective was experiencing. For the first time in millions of years, it was facing a situation where its superior knowledge and logical thinking were not just useless, they were actively harmful. Every calculation it made was wrong. Every prediction failed. Every strategic principle it had learned from hundreds of conquered species led to failure. Dr. Ythara's brain patterns had shifted to a color none of the observers had ever seen before, a swirling mixture of purple and gold that indicated her analytical systems were operating far beyond their normal parameters. You're suggesting that an intelligence composed of billions of minds could experience individual psychological trauma. I'm not suggesting it, Sarah replied firmly. I'm telling you it happened. The collective intelligence, for all its vast knowledge and computational power, was still based on organic consciousness patterns. And organic consciousness, no matter how advanced, has certain universal vulnerabilities. The recording showed the enemy fleet beginning to withdraw from the battle, not in an organized tactical retreat, but in something approaching panic. Ships collided with each other as they tried to escape. Weapons fired at random targets, and several vessels actually began attacking their own escorts. The collective was experiencing cognitive dissonance on a scale it had never imagined possible, Sarah explained. Every absorbed mind within its consciousness was trying to make sense of what they were seeing, and failing. The rational voices were being drowned out by sheer bewilderment. Ambassador Zarathal's empathic abilities were detecting emotional resonances from the recordings that shouldn't have been possible. I can sense confusion, fear, something that feels almost like vertigo. The collective intelligence was falling apart. Sarah nodded. Not physically, but psychologically, the very foundation of its existence. The certainty that superior knowledge and logical thinking would always prevail was crumbling beneath the weight of human stupidity. The battle recording reached its climax as the human fleet, reduced to less than 50 functional ships, continued their chaotic attack against an enemy force that was now actively fleeing the engagement. The sight of 12,000 advanced warships running from 50 damaged human vessels should have been comedy, but the implications were too vast for humor. That's when I realized we had won, Sarah said quietly. Not the battle. We were still hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered. But we had won the war. The collective intelligence would never again be able to function as a unified entity. It would spend the rest of its existence trying to understand what had happened here. And that uncertainty would tear it apart from within. General Thakmore's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. A psychological victory rather than a military one. The only kind of victory that mattered, Sarah agreed. Physical destruction of the collective would have been temporary. It could rebuild its fleets, replace its losses, develop new strategies. But psychological destruction? That was permanent. Once we had introduced the concept of fundamental uncertainty into its consciousness, there was no way to remove it. The recording showed the aftermath of the battle, as the surviving human ships regrouped among the wreckage of their fallen comrades. They had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history, but the cost had been staggering. Of the 300 ships that had entered the battle, only 47 remained functional. The human casualties were nearly total. 17,000 of my people died in that battle, Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of command decisions that would haunt her forever. Good people, brave people, people who trusted me to lead them to victory. Instead, I led them to die for a cause they didn't fully understand. Dr. People, Ythara's analytical mind was still struggling with the implications of what she had witnessed. But if the collective intelligence was psychologically damaged beyond repair, why did the war continue for another 3 months? Sarah's expression grew even grimmer. Because psychological damage doesn't mean immediate collapse. The collective was still vast, still powerful, and still dangerous. But now it was also unpredictable, erratic, and increasingly desperate. Those final 3 months were the most dangerous period of the entire war. The viewing screens shifted to show star charts from the war's final phase, displaying movement patterns that defied all previous enemy behavior. Collective fleets that had once moved with perfect coordination now wandered seemingly at random through space. Some attacked coalition strongholds with overwhelming force. Others bypassed strategic targets to assault meaningless outposts, and a few simply disappeared into the dark spaces between stars. The fragmented collective began to behave like a wounded animal, Sarah continued, lashing out unpredictably, striking at targets that served no strategic purpose, sometimes even attacking empty space as if it saw threats that weren't there. It was during this period that the 3 processing worlds became active. The mention of the world Sarah had bombarded brought the Assembly's attention back to the most controversial aspect of her wartime actions. The tactical displays now showed the massive installations that the collective had constructed on those 3 planets. Facilities designed to process captured populations into new components of its consciousness. The collective intelligence was trying to stabilize itself, Sarah explained. It knew that something had gone fundamentally wrong with its psychological equilibrium, but it didn't understand what. Its response was to absorb more minds, hoping that additional consciousness patterns would help it regain its previous stability. Ambassador Vexhi's mental voice carried a note of horror. It was attempting to cure its psychological trauma by consuming more victims. 2 billion beings from 43 species, Sarah confirmed. Entire populations that had been captured during the war's earlier phases held in stasis until the collective decided how best to use them. When its psychological crisis began, it saw them as potential solutions to its problem. The mathematics of the situation were staggering. The absorption of 2 billion additional minds would not only have increased the collective's power exponentially, but might have provided the psychological stability it needed to continue its conquest of the galaxy. The rescue mission would have taken weeks to organize and execute, General Tackmore observed. Standard coalition protocol required approval from at least 3 species high commands before engaging in operations of that magnitude, which would have given the collective more than enough time to complete the absorption process, Sarah agreed. By the time a rescue fleet arrived, those 2 billion beings would have become part of the enemy we were fighting. Not only would we have lost any chance to save them, but we would have made our enemy twice as powerful and potentially restored its psychological stability. The moral calculus was hideous but undeniable. Any conventional rescue attempt would have failed and made the situation infinitely worse. The only way to prevent the collective from absorbing those 2 billion minds was to ensure that neither the minds nor the processing facilities remained intact. So I made the decision that no committee would ever approve, no rational commander would ever consider, and no civilized species would ever understand, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I took it upon myself to commit the greatest war crime in galactic history to prevent something far worse. The orbital bombardment recordings began to play on the viewing screens, showing the systematic destruction of 3 entire worlds. The weapons Sarah had used were designed for planetary sterilization, ensuring that no trace of biological matter would survive. In less than 6 hours, she had eliminated not only the collective's processing facilities but every living thing on 3 planets. 2,340,7,820,6,412 individuals, Sarah recited from memory. 43 species, including some that are now extinct because their entire remaining populations were on those worlds. I know their numbers because I made myself memorize them. I know their names because I spent 3 years reading every casualty report, every missing person file, every family record of the people I killed. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the Assembly's life support system seemed to fade as every consciousness in the chamber contemplated the magnitude of what they had just heard. The psychological impact on the collective was immediate and total, Sarah continued. Faced with an enemy willing to commit genocide to deny them victory, the various fragments of its consciousness began to turn on each other. Some wanted to escalate the war to unprecedented levels of violence. Others advocated for immediate withdrawal from the galaxy. Still others simply shut down, unable to process the implications of what they had witnessed. Dr. Yathara's brain patterns had stabilized into deep blue, indicating profound understanding mixed with existential uncertainty. You didn't just defeat the collective intelligence, you taught it to fear. I taught it what every organic species learns eventually, Sarah corrected. That survival sometimes requires choices so terrible that they change who you are fundamentally. The collective had absorbed the knowledge of hundreds of species, but it had never truly understood the psychological cost of making impossible decisions. The war's final recordings showed the collective's fleets withdrawing from every contested system simultaneously, not in organized retreats or strategic repositioning, but in what could only be described as flight. Ships that had fought with perfect coordination for years suddenly scattered in all directions, some heading for the galactic rim, others diving into dark matter regions where they couldn't be tracked. Within a week of the orbital bombardments, the collective intelligence had effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity, Sarah said. Its various fragments fled to different parts of the galaxy, and as far as our intelligence services can determine, they've spent the last 5 years hiding from each other as much as from us. The victory had been complete, but at a price that defied calculation. The immediate threat to galactic civilization had ended, but the methods used to achieve that victory had created moral and philosophical questions that would challenge every species for generations to come. The assembly hall remained silent for long minutes after Sarah finished her account. Representatives from 300 species sat motionless, their various forms of consciousness processing implications that challenged everything they thought they understood about warfare, morality, and the nature of victory itself. Ambassador Vexay was the first to speak, his mental voice carrying undertones of profound uncertainty. Colonel Chen, what you have described is not merely a war crime. It is a fundamental violation of everything that civilized beings hold sacred. Yet you claim it was necessary to save us all. Sarah looked up at the Altarian ambassador, her brown eyes reflecting a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion. I don't claim it was necessary, Ambassador. I know it was necessary. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't make me less guilty of genocide. That doesn't change the fact that I personally ordered the deaths of over 2 billion innocent beings. She stood slowly from her chair, her hands steady despite the magnitude of her confession. But I would do it again. If faced with the same choice tomorrow, save 2 billion lives or lose the entire galaxy, I would make the same decision. That's what you need to understand about humans. We don't just make the hard choices. We make the impossible ones, and we live with the consequences. Dr. Yithara's brain patterns had shifted to deep purple, indicating calculations beyond normal parameters. Our psychological models suggest that making such a decision should result in complete mental breakdown. How did you maintain functional cognition? Who says I did? Sarah replied with a bitter laugh. I haven't slept more than 2 consecutive hours in 5 years. I can't be in crowds without experiencing panic attacks. I see the faces of the people I killed every time I close my eyes. My own medical officers have recommended psychological intervention 17 times, and I've refused treatment each time. The admission sent ripples of concern through the assembly. The idea that the person who had saved them all was suffering from severe psychological trauma added another layer of complexity to an already impossible moral situation. Why refuse treatment? Asked Ambassador Zaratharol, her empathic abilities detecting pain levels that should have been incapacitating. Because forgetting would be the worst crime of all, Sarah answered. Those 2 billion people died because of my decision. The least I can do is remember them, carry their weight, and never let myself believe that what I did was anything other than monstrous. The moment I start to feel better about it, the moment I convince myself it was just another military necessity, I become something worse than the enemy we fought. General Thakmore's compound eyes focused intently on the human colonel. You punish yourself to maintain your humanity. I punish myself because I chose to sacrifice my humanity to save everyone else's, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. What I did was necessary, but it was also evil. Those two things can coexist, and pretending otherwise dishonors the people who died. The philosophical implications were staggering. Most species had evolved moral frameworks that required clear distinctions between right and wrong, necessary and unnecessary, heroic and villainous. The idea that an action could be simultaneously necessary and evil, that someone could be both savior and monster, challenged the fundamental assumptions of civilized thinking. The fragments of the collective intelligence, Dr. Yitara said, changing the subject to something more analytically manageable. Our intelligence services have been unable to locate most of them. Do you believe they still pose a threat? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. The fragments that fled to the galactic rim are probably trying to rebuild, but they're operating with incomplete knowledge and damaged psychological patterns. They might become a threat again in a few hundred years, but not to our generation. She paused, looking at the star charts displayed around the assembly. The fragments that fled into dark matter regions are more concerning. They're effectively beyond our ability to track or engage, and we have no way of knowing what they're doing out there. They could be healing, evolving, or planning their return. And the fragments that are hiding within known space? Asked Ambassador Vexai. Those are the ones that worry me most, Sarah admitted. Some of them have probably integrated into existing civilizations, masquerading as normal citizens, while they study our current capabilities and defensive preparations. The collective learned to fear humanity, but fear can motivate revenge as easily as retreat. The implications sent a chill through the assembly. The idea that fragments of their ancient enemy might be living among them, watching and learning, was almost too disturbing to contemplate. Which brings me to why I insisted on this hearing, Sarah continued. Attendance from Ceresia Luz is a tyrannous. The official records of the war have been sanitized, classified, and locked away. Most of the galaxy believes we won through superior tactics and heroic sacrifice. Very few beings know the truth about what actually happened during those final months. General Takmor's antennae twitched with understanding. You want the truth to be known. I want the galaxy to understand what humans are really like, Sarah said firmly. Not the sanitized version that your diplomats prefer to deal with. Not the primitive but improving species that your integration protocols are designed to manage. I want you to understand what we become when everything we care about is threatened. She began to pace around her table, her movements carrying the controlled tension of a predator. The collective intelligence made one crucial error in its assessment of humanity. It studied our military doctrine, our technological capabilities, our historical conflicts, and our social structures. It thought it understood what we were capable of. Ambassador Zarathul's empathic senses were detecting something in Sarah's emotional patterns that made her physically uncomfortable. What did it fail to understand? It studied what humans do when we're winning, when we're losing, when we're fighting for territory or resources or ideology, Sarah replied. But it never studied what humans do when we're fighting for survival. Not just our own survival, but the survival of everything we consider worth protecting. The distinction seemed subtle, but the emotional undertones Sarah was projecting suggested it was anything but. Every empathic species in the assembly was beginning to sense something that made their various forms of consciousness recoil instinctively. When humans fight for territory, we can be reasoned with, Sarah continued. When we fight for resources, we can be negotiated with. When we fight for ideology, we can be converted, or at least contained. But when we fight for survival, real survival, existential survival, we become something else entirely. Yatara's analytical processes were detecting patterns in Sarah's speech that suggested she was building toward a revelation that would dwarf everything she had already disclosed. What do you become? Sarah stopped pacing and looked directly at the Cerebral's tank. We become the thing that extinction-level threats should be afraid of. We become the species that looks at impossible odds and says, challenge accepted. We become the kind of beings that will burn down the entire galaxy rather than let someone else rule it. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Every delegate in the assembly understood that they were hearing something that redefined their understanding of their human allies. The collective intelligence thought it was fighting a primitive species that could be absorbed like all the others. Sarah continued. It never considered that it might be fighting a species that had evolved specifically to be the thing that other extinction events run away from. Ambassador Vexay's mental voice carried a note of deep concern. You speak as if this transformation is permanent. For some of us it is, Sarah admitted. The soldiers who fought in the final battles, the commanders who made the impossible decisions, the civilians who supported actions they knew were monstrous. We've all been changed by what we did. We've seen what we're capable of when pushed to our absolute limits, and we can never go back to being what we were before. The psychological trauma extended beyond individual cases to entire populations. Humanity as a species had been forced to confront aspects of their nature that they had never fully acknowledged, and that revelation had permanent implications. But that's why this hearing is so important, Sarah continued. The galaxy needs to understand what it's allying with. You need to know that humanity's friendship comes with the kind of loyalty that will commit genocide to protect you, but also with the kind of loyalty that might commit genocide to protect itself if it perceives you as a threat. The warning was clear and unmistakable. Humanity had proven itself capable of actions that violated every principle of civilized behavior when they believed survival was at stake. That capability hadn't disappeared with the end of the war. "What are you asking of us?" General Tackmore inquired, his compound eyes reflecting deep thought. "I'm asking you to make an informed decision about humanity's place in the Galactic Coalition," Sarah replied. "Knowing what you know now, understanding what we're really capable of, decide whether you want us as allies or whether you'd prefer to keep us at arm's length." The choice she was offering was stark and unprecedented. Most species joined the coalition through gradual integration processes designed to minimize cultural shock and ensure compatibility. Sarah was essentially asking for a referendum on humanity's membership, based on full disclosure of their darkest capabilities. "But I'm also asking you to understand something else," she continued. "The methods I used to defeat the collective intelligence weren't uniquely mine. They weren't the result of military training or strategic planning or advanced technology. They were the logical extension of fundamental human nature when faced with existential threats." Dr. Yathara's brain patterns shifted to deep orange, indicating alarm. "You're suggesting that any human might be capable of similar actions under similar circumstances?" "I'm not suggesting it," Sarah said firmly. "I'm stating it as fact. Put any human in a situation where they believe everything they care about is about to be destroyed, and they will become capable of things that will terrify you. We don't choose to become monsters. We just refuse to let other monsters win." The implications were staggering. If Sarah was correct, then humanity as a species represented a form of insurance policy against extinction-level threats, but also a potential threat of unprecedented magnitude if they ever perceived the coalition itself as an enemy. "The collective intelligence learned too late that there are some species you don't want to corner," Sarah continued. "Some forms of life that become more dangerous as their situation becomes more desperate. Humans evolved to be persistent predators, but more than that, we evolved to be the thing that extinction events should avoid." She looked around the assembly, meeting the various forms of eyes and sensors focused on her. "So I'm asking you to vote, not on whether I'm guilty of war crimes. I've already admitted that I am. I'm asking you to vote on whether you want a species like mine in your coalition, knowing full well what we're capable of when we think we're fighting for our survival." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in her testimony. This wasn't the silence of shock or contemplation, but the silence of beings grappling with a decision that would shape the future of galactic civilization. Ambassador Zarathul spoke for many when she said, "You're asking us to choose between security and moral comfort. I'm asking you to choose with full knowledge of what that choice entails," Sarah corrected. "Humanity can be your greatest ally or your most dangerous enemy, but we can't be both simultaneously. What we become depends largely on how you treat us, and whether you give us reason to believe you're a threat to our survival." General Tackmore's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or concern. "You're essentially holding the entire galaxy hostage to ensure your species' acceptance. I'm ensuring that whatever decision you make it with complete understanding of the consequences," Sarah replied. "If you vote to expel humanity from the coalition, we'll accept that decision and withdraw to our own systems. But you'll do so knowing that you're turning away the species that saved you all from absorption by a collective intelligence. And if we vote to maintain your membership despite these revelations," asked Dr. Buxio, "Yatara, then you'll be allying with a species that will go to any length to protect what it considers worth protecting," Sarah said, "including each of you, your civilizations, and everything you've built together, but also including our own interests, our own people, and our own survival." The choice was clear, but neither option was entirely comfortable. Accept humanity with full knowledge of their capabilities and risk future conflicts if their interests diverged. Reject humanity and lose the protection of a species that had proven capable of defeating threats beyond anyone else's ability to handle. I need you all to understand one final thing, Sarah said as her testimony drew to its conclusion. What I did during the war wasn't the result of advanced planning or superior training or unique individual characteristics. It was the result of being human when everything I cared about was threatened. Any other human in my position would have made similar choices, committed similar acts, and lived with similar consequences. She paused, looking up at the vast dome of the assembly hall, where the light of distant stars painted patterns on the crystalline ceiling. The collective intelligence spent centuries studying your species, learning your capabilities, preparing to absorb your knowledge and add your distinctiveness to its own. It thought it understood what it was facing when it encountered humanity, but it had never encountered a species that would rather become the monster than let the monster win. It had never faced beings so fundamentally stubborn that they would choose mutual destruction over surrender. It had never fought an enemy that considered genocide an acceptable price for victory. The weight of her words settled over the assembly like a physical presence. Every delegate understood that they were making a decision that would echo through history regardless of which choice they made. So vote, Sarah said simply. But vote knowing that whatever you decide, humanity will remain what we've always been. The species that looks at extinction and laughs, that faces impossible odds with impossible solutions, and that will burn the galaxy down before we let someone else rule it. Vote knowing that we saved you all, and that we're capable of doing it again if necessary. Vote knowing that we're your greatest potential ally and your greatest potential threat. Vote knowing exactly what humans are really like. The silence that followed was the silence of 300 civilizations contemplating a choice that would define the future of the galaxy. In the viewing galleries above, human observers watched their representative conclude testimony that would either secure their species' place among the stars or condemn them to isolation at the galaxy's edge. But Sarah Chen had done what she came to do. She had told the truth about humanity's nature, about the price of their victory, and about the choices they were willing to make when survival was at stake. Now it was time for the galaxy to decide what to do with that knowledge. The vote, when it came, would be close. But whatever the outcome, no one would ever again be able to claim they didn't understand what humans were really like.